The weird, upside-down nightmare world we live in these days recently took another surreal turn when the famous Notre Dame cathedral caught fire on April 15th, 2019. The world watched in disbelief and horror as the 305-foot spire collapsed into the roof, completely engulfed in flames, with hundreds of Parisians standing by watching helplessly, singing in unison. Taking a look at the spectacle from afar, I think it's pretty fair to say, Jesus fucking Christ. As bad as it is, the good news is that video games are still there for us, and not in our usual, we want to forget about our day kind of way. Video games may save Notre Dame in a very literal sense, which is needed because the cathedral isn't doing so hot after the fire. Oof. While the fire burned for 15 hours and much of the original wooden roof and iconic spire is now gone, the building is still largely intact.
Notre Dame has been horribly wounded, but she is still alive.
And thanks to the generosity from those around the world, the rebuilding process can begin. The problem is, Notre Dame is seriously old, like finished initial construction in 1260-ish old. And that was after 182 years of construction. It's a meticulously crafted piece of architecture that, due to its complicated design and specific materials, may never be the same. One of the priests has already said that the cathedral will be closed off for at least 5 or 6 years, and some predict that it will be decades before the church can be fully repaired. Odds are those responsible for the rebuild will need to reference as many resources as possible to get the job done. But for such a famous structure, surprisingly little is known about its construction. We actually don't even know who built the place. There are no records. All we know is that it was commissioned in the 1100s by the then Bishop of Paris, who we assume didn't actually build the thing himself. Oddly enough, the key to accurately recapturing the cathedral's beauty may lie in a video game. The 2014 game Assassin's Creed Unity, to be specific. Congratulations, gamers, we've done it again. We are the sword in the darkness, the watcher on the walls, the shield that guards the realms of men. Sorry, I've been watching a lot of Thrones lately. Anyways, you may remember Assassin's Creed Unity for its Lord-scored cinematic trailer and some of the most chilling face bugs I've ever seen. Or non-face bugs? Eesh. It was ultimately a fine game, not quite living up to the previous year's Black Flag, but still enjoyable for returning fans of the series. But for all its shortcomings, Assassin's Creed Unity has been sitting on some incredible information that was almost certainly taken for granted until now. Turns out one of the most painstakingly accurate 3D renderings of the cathedral in existence is actually in a video game, of all things. And it also doesn't hurt that you can climb all over every inch of the thing and see it up close. You may have seen this story bouncing around the internet lately, and understandably, it's a pretty sensational title. Video game brings famous church back from fiery demise. Ranked. It's the kind of feel-good, hobby-validating story we love to see, but this is specifically a really wonderful moment in gaming because this solution could actually hold some water. Unity's Notre Dame is an incredible example of solid game design because while the Assassin's Creed franchise has had its issues with gameplay, story, combat, bugs, and what feels like 1,000 other things, it's always prided itself on historical accuracy. In every entry so far, the setting of the game is as important as any character, if not more so. Assassin's Creed Origins even provided an exploration mode called the Discovery Tour that cut out almost everything and allowed a player to simply experience the studio's stunning recreation of ancient Egypt. Actually, this one professor in Canada even tried to teach a history class using the mode. So when we talk about this incredible rendition of Notre Dame, we need to thank Carolyn Miouz, the senior level designer on Unity, who was tasked with assembling the in-game version of the cathedral. In fact, in her time spent developing the game, 80% was spent on the cathedral alone. And after 2 years of reading, referencing photos, speaking with historians, and checking that every brick was placed correctly, Miouz had indeed created a model of the church that was impeccably accurate. The process took countless hours, and in an interview she referred to the Notre Dame job as her big monster baby, so it's safe to assume it was a labor of love. Makes me miss my own big monster baby, Thomas. He escaped his pen near 6 months ago, and maybe tomorrow morning I'll find my beautiful large son asleep on the porch. Ubisoft, itself a French company, has already pledged to donate $500,000 towards the rebuilding of Notre Dame, and is clearly invested in the cathedral's well-being, but a full 3D map from before the fire is comparatively priceless. What's interesting is that Unity's version isn't 100% technically accurate to the French Revolution time period. Early on, a build of the game featured a Notre Dame that was faithful to the time and setting, even down to the paintings on the wall, and every brick painstakingly placed in accordance with the actual building at the time. Miyuz originally designed the model according to how the cathedral would have appeared in the late 1700s. It didn't include the most recent spire, which was added during 19th century renovations. But playtesters felt that something was missing, so Miyuz opted to update the structure to be more recognizable. The game's art director Mohamed Gambouz put it best: "The aim is not to be 100% historically accurate. It's to convey a believable setting, a believable city, and sometimes we even go for the perception people have, even if it's not 100% accurate." And so the anachronistic spire was included, and for good reason. It was the highest point of Notre Dame, and the Assassin's Creed series is all about climbing to those impossible heights, and then diving into a random hay bale that's somehow sitting perfectly placed on the street. As Miyuz said, "From a gameplay perspective, we had to change the inside a bit just to add several layers of navigation. It's not enough to simply recreate the monument. People need to be able to have fun when they play around on and in it. We're making a game, and it has to be enjoyable." And while this was done with the player in mind, keeping the most current version in the game might have ultimately been the best for the actual cathedral itself, as Ubisoft now has a full 3D model on hand. Because Miyuz added her own touches and design aspects, her Notre Dame isn't completely one-to-one with the original cathedral. For instance, the organ inside the building is actually copywritten and couldn't legally be included in the game. Unity's version is balanced by a laser-rendered model created by art historian Andrew Tallon in an attempt to understand the mystifying Gothic architecture. Like Miyuz, Tallon also spent 2 years creating his 3D rendition of Notre Dame, cross-referencing and combining his scans with photos of the structure. The process resulted in an extremely accurate representation of the building that was, according to the late Tallon, accurate to within 5 millimeters.
Damn.
And this isn't the first time a historical cathedral has been linked with innovative computer technology. It's why architects all over the world use something called parametric design software. The tool became relevant in the 90s when it was used to continue construction on La Sagrada Familia, a Spanish cathedral otherwise known as the world's longest-running construction project. The original visionary behind the cathedral, Anthony Gaudi, died in 1926, and when his plaster models were destroyed, much of the cathedral's design was left to guesswork. Gothic design is so intricate and specific that computer software is sometimes the best, if not the only way to understand a structure like this. And having multiple 3D models of possibly one of the most famous Gothic cathedrals ever constructed is outstanding. Talon's model contains crucial measurements and dimensions of the building, and Miyuz is capturing what it felt like to be inside the building, in addition to her wireframe of the church's dimensions, are nothing short of painstaking. And just as important as the raw information she collected were the people Miyuz spoke to. As valuable a resource as Google and books and Ubisoft's historians were, Miyuz's most valuable resources in the recreation were first-hand accounts from those who have stood in the cathedral. She wanted to capture what it felt like to be in Notre Dame and translate that to the player. So much so that when Miyuz finally visited the cathedral for the first time, she said, "I felt like I was coming home." At this point, it's hard to say exactly what will be used in the rebuild of Notre Dame and to what extent. Some aspects are going to be impossible to replace, like the super old timbers that made up the original roof. The vice president of the French Heritage Foundation explained, "We don't at the moment have trees on our territory of the size that were cut in the 13th century. That's a valid excuse. It's still early, and a great deal of the work right now lies in assessing structural integrity and recovering still usable materials from the debris. While it's undoubtedly tragic that this happened at all, Notre Dame has actually been rebuilt before, following its abuse and pillaging during the French Revolution after decades of neglect, wind damage, and regular statue bashing. The cathedral has remained. And this time, more information about the structure is available than ever before, in large part thanks to one dedicated video game artist. The question now is whether Notre Dame will be rebuilt to its precise state before the fire. French President Emmanuel Macron vowed to have the repairs completed in 5 years,
and we will rebuild it. We will rebuild Notre Dame.
And the Prime Minister has announced an architecture competition that will be held to recreate the spire, but obviously it may not end up looking quite the same. The international competition will allow us to ask the question of whether we should even try to recreate the spire as it was initially conceived, or, as is often the case in the evolution of heritage, if we should endow Notre Dame with some kind of new spire. So for all we know, France could take this as an opportunity to actually just update the famous cathedral. But even if the rebuilders don't fully rely on Miyuz's work, Ubisoft has been giving away Assassin's Creed Unity for free for a limited time so people can still experience Notre Dame as best they can, untouched by fire. higher. I actually still can't decide if that's an incredibly stand-up thing of Ubisoft to do or just some seriously advantageous free marketing. Ubisoft would actually join a tradition of art saving the cathedral. In the early 1800s, Notre Dame had fallen into disrepair and was considered by many to be an eyesore, until Victor Hugo published his seminal novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Hugo spent multiple chapters detailing and fleshing out the building, treating the cathedral as a central character in the book. Sound familiar? Once the book found success, it caused the people of Paris to appreciate the structure again, eventually inspiring renovation efforts. Video games are undoubtedly art, so it's pretty cool seeing an even arguably forgettable Assassin's Creed game treated as such, and becoming part of a conversation around one of the most important pieces of architecture in the world. At the time, we didn't understand that a so-called easy mode overlaps with a very different and very important issue: accessibility. Talking about this is complicated since there's a fair amount of overlap in that Venn diagram, not to mention tons of charged opinions that are informed by a perceived culture war that is still roiling inside games culture.